Mitch Barnhart and Kentucky have offered the premier college basketball coaching job to Scott Drew. He can replace John Calipari tomorrow if he wants. The news breaking Tuesday night from Keith Taylor, who was the first one on this. He is boots on the ground in Kentucky. He is a beat writer and works for Kentucky Today and the Berea Citizen. He has said that Kentucky has offered the job to Scott Drew. All this speculation is coming into fruition right now. And it, honestly, if you look at it, it can't be surprising. I mean, Scott Drew was the odds-on favorite from the beginning. He was the primary target. That's another term we heard on Tuesday in a report from NJ.com and Andrew Zangoria. And it's, if you're a Kentucky fan, it has to feel like it's falling into place. If you're a Baylor fan, this is, your stomach is in knots. My stomach is in knots. It is becoming realer and realer by the minute. And it's one of those things, I talked about this ad nauseum yesterday, that Louisville and Indiana and Memphis, those are one thing. Kentucky is an entirely different thing. No matter how you are wired, you listen when Kentucky calls. You pick up the phone. And Kentucky is calling. They are calling big time, to the point of offering Scott Drew the job. And honestly, even before this offer came out, the longer this thing went, the more it pointed towards Scott Drew. Because, you look at it, and Dan Hurley said no. Nate Oates said no. Billy Donovan's on a different timeline. That leaves you with Scott Drew. And then a couple of guys who aren't as hot right now as Scott Drew. Guys like Bruce Pearl and Rick Pitino, who are good coaches for sure. No doubt. Pitino's a Hall of Famer. But right now, it's Scott Drew's job to lose. And the fact that that is getting leaked from Kentucky people, that is not a great sign, because they've already flubbed a leak. Okay. They put out that they had offered Dan Hurley about 6 years and $77 million. And, nothing against Scott Drew here, but that's probably a higher price than you would have needed to pay for Scott Drew. So that already is a bad leak. Kentucky doesn't want a second bad leak. So if they're putting out there that they've offered the job to Scott Drew, they have to feel good about this thing. And it's just it's surreal to even be thinking that Scott is this close. Now, of course, we have not heard anything from Scott Drew, and I don't imagine we will till maybe the end of this week. Like, totally fair. Let this thing breathe a couple of days. None of us make a decision on a job in a couple of hours. But the longer this thing stays silent, the worse you have to feel as a Baylor fan. Other names are dropping out of the race except your guys. Scott Drew's still there. And so you look at that list that was there at the beginning of the week, and it was Scott Drew, it was Dan Hurley, it was Nate Oates, it was Billy Donovan, it was all these guys, and then Hurley says no. And then Oates says no. And Donovan, you're going to have to wait a couple weeks until the Bulls lose in the in-season, in the play-in tournament. And they might not want to wait around for that. And for Scott Drew in this relationship in particular, Mitch Barnhart seems to be buddy-buddy with Scott. And, for most of you who have met Scott or you just see him on TV and in the interviews, that's no surprise. He's one of the nicest guys I've ever met. And apparently they are good friends. In fact, Barnhart was kind of the NCAA sort of liaison, glorified chaperone of the hotel that Baylor was staying at in the bubble in Indianapolis when they went and won the national championship in 2021. So obviously Baylor was there longer than anybody else. And so, of course, Scott struck up a relationship with Mitch Barnhart, and Barnhart gets a front row seat of Scott Drew's crowning coaching accomplishment, winning the national championship. Best believe that's a different perspective than some other ADs would have on Scott Drew. Oh, man. This is as real as it's felt. And honestly, if you ask me right now, I would still say Scott's different. Scott's going to stay. But the longer we don't hear from him and we hear from other coaches saying no, then the closer I am to 50-50. In fact, I would look at it, I would use the analogy of going to a baseball game live, okay? And every pop fly looks like a home run if you're watching the ball. But if you're watching the outfielders, you know that it's probably routine most of the time. If you're just waiting for Scott Drew to say something, you're not going to get any satisfaction. But if you see the other coaches drop out of the race, then you're like, yikes, man. Well, clearly they're still talking to Scott Drew. He hasn't said anything, and they're running out of options. And right now they have narrowed their option. They have other guys, I'm sure, that are on speed dial ready to go. But this would be a big embarrassment for Kentucky if they have put out an offer to a top line head coach and he says no to stay at Baylor. That would be an embarrassment for Kentucky. And they're only used to getting embarrassed in the round of 64. Okay. They're not used to getting embarrassed on the coaching search. And so the longer we don't hear anything, the closer I get to 50-50 on whether he stays. Of course, there are still things to point at to say, hey, here's why he's going to stay. One of which being he is a different breed. He is different from most of what we know in college athletics. He's not Lincoln Riley. He's not John Calipari. He's not any of these guys who would just jump at the next bigger job, because we've seen him turn that down time and time again, to the point where those jobs that were bigger than Baylor when he was, rumored to be going there are now not bigger than Baylor. But there are a few that still are bigger. And one of them is Kentucky, and they have offered him the job. He's got a daughter at Baylor. He's built a new house in Waco. All of those things would point towards him staying. But Kentucky can offer him something that no other school can. They can potentially double his salary, even though he's one of the highest paid college basketball coaches right now. And they can give him the keys to the most prestigious car in all of college basketball, the Kentucky Wildcats. And that still scares me. And for each minute that goes by, it scares me even more. I can't lie to you guys.